This story starts in my bedroom, a fairly cold, damp, and small space. It wasn't the best room, but it was mine, and I loved it. At the time, I had been having a hard couple of weeks with my mental health, suffering from some fairly severe anxiety and stress issues. I have suffered with anxiety all of my grown life, but it gets more severe during times of high stress. At the time, work was very stressful. In addition, my country was under strict social restrictions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. All these factors combined make for a very bad situation to be taking psychedelics, but at the time I underestimated the power of LSD and did not respect it as I should have. I decided in the morning to take some of the LSD I had bought online a few months ago after a particularly difficult night. This was motivated by past positive experiences I have had with psychedelics, mostly psilocybin, which had really changed my worldview and helped a lot with my longer-term mental health issues. I was aiming to get some clarity on the causes for my anxieties and potentially to access some difficult truths that I was in denial about that I could use to improve my mental health. I took the tab, unknown strength, in the late morning as I knew LSD lasts a long time and I wanted it to be done at a reasonable time for sleeping. I stuck it on my tongue and let it sit for a while, then chewed it up and swallowed. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just watched some miscellaneous videos on my computer. 1 hour in, I was starting to feel the effects. I felt a bit wobbly and strange, and the music I was listening to at the time started to really feel very intense and almost take over my mind. At this point, I would describe the feeling as fairly positive. I put on some of my favorite music on my phone and went to lie down on my bed and listen to it. I was still alone in my room. I lived in a shared household at the time, and my plan was largely to keep to myself. I hadn't informed anyone else I was going to be tripping. 3 hours in, I had been listening to the music for a long time and had been really entranced by it. I was experiencing intense visuals, which were very geometrical and consisted of thousands of infinitely tessellating fractals. It was really very beautiful, but also incredibly intense. At this point, I felt inspired to go and create some art, so I got out my sketch pad and a pen and started jotting down endless geometric patterns combined with many, many human eyes. I was just allowing my brain to take the wheel with the drawing, almost moving the pen on autopilot slowly. At some point, I went to the toilet as I'd been drinking a lot of water and it was making its way through me. I remember feeling a bit anxious about this as I didn't want my housemates to notice my state, and the bathroom felt very creepy to be in. I think I was stuck in the bathroom for about 15 minutes as I was struggling to function properly. I continued with the drawing for around half an hour and then headed back to bed to listen to some relaxing music as I felt a little overwhelmed. 4 hours in, I don't remember much of what happened between the drawing and now, but I remember this very vividly. I sat on the corner of my bed and suddenly, out of nowhere, I just knew that I was dead. I was suddenly 100% unequivocally convinced that I had died in my bed, and I was now experiencing some sort of afterlife. At this point, I was still experiencing strong visuals, but they were almost in the background of my mind. As a feeling of sheer panic set in, my perception of time slowed down to a sheer standstill, and I was completely overwhelmed by anxiety. I was shaking and sweating. I looked at myself in the mirror in my room, and it felt like I was looking at someone else. I kind of knew logically that it was me, but it didn't feel like me. It's hard to explain. I felt completely dissociated from my body, and my physical form felt more like a curiosity. At this point, I was completely and utterly out of my depth. From now on, I was just in a state of complete living nightmare. I went and sat in a spot in my room where the heating unit was, leaning against it and covering myself in a blanket. The physical sensation of heat was giving me a very faint kind of grounding, but I still was 100% convinced that I was not alive and that this was me forever now. 5.5 hours in, at this point I'd just been sitting against the heater for around 1 hour. These times are vague estimates as my perception of time was very warped. Everything was incredibly slow. I was trying to calm myself down by watching random calming videos on YouTube and eating some snacks. However, I was still in a state of complete fear and panic. I cannot even describe this feeling. It is completely incomparable to any level of fear I've ever experienced in my life. I did not feared death. I feared the infinity of potential suffering that could exist. I feared the feeling of experiencing this fear for an eternity and being unable to ever escape it. I could not even kill myself to end it, as I was already dead. My poor brain had just completely melted into a soup of one pure raw emotion: fear. My vision was completely tunneled. I was shaking and my legs were spasming. I would imagine my heart rate was high at this point, but I did not check. I periodically checked myself in the mirror to check if my pupils were dilated and almost try to convince myself that I was high, but I still could not shake the absolute certainty of the feeling that I was dead. In fact, at this point, I had the feeling that I had died 1,000 times over. And I'm not even sure what that means or where that came from. 9 hours in. At this point, I'd been stuck in a cycle of lying in bed, leaning against my heater, and occasionally using my computer to access some relaxing, nature-based videos to try and soothe myself. I was urinating very frequently, as I had been drinking a very high amount of water, as I for some reason felt like it would help me. In hindsight, I may have given myself some mild form of hyponatremia, which would have only added to my negative experience. Every time I went to the toilet, I was terrified. I found the room so scary, as it was very dark and dingy, and also it did not feel private from my housemates. I had severe anxiety about my housemates finding out about everything when they came into my room and found my body. I think this situation of being alone and feeling worried about others finding out about the trip was a major cause of all the anxiety I experienced during this trip. The visuals were largely over at this point, with just some residual minor disturbances to my vision. This, however, did not give me any mental relief. I still felt like I was dead and I'd been sent to hell. This hell for me was experiencing this feeling of completely overwhelming anxiety forever. The anxiety fed anxiety about being anxious, and formed a vicious cycle that I did not have the mental fortitude to break. 18 hours after ingestion, not much changed over the 9 hours from the last paragraph. I felt completely overwhelmed by fear and was stuck in a constant loop of the bathroom, my bed, the heater, and trying to soothe myself with various online resources. At this point, I had not had any human contact in around 24 hours or more, and I felt completely insane. I did not feel like this experience would ever end. I researched the duration of LSD. I had done this beforehand too. I was at least always fairly responsible with research, and saw that I was well over the expected duration for intense effects. In hindsight, I was no longer really tripping except for some minor after effects, but I was in fact trapped in what was at this point essentially a 14H nonstop panic attack. I was completely exhausted but completely unable to sleep. My mind was running at 1,000 kph and only focused on these things. I was dead, I was insane, I was terrified. Time was passing incredibly slowly as I was in a constant state of fight or flight. It was now very early morning of the next day and I needed to urinate again. This time, I decided I simply could not face going into the bathroom, so I grabbed a blanket and rolled it up and left the house. It was raining outside, and I walked about 2 km to a park. Not the nearest park at all, just one I remembered from a few years back. I had intended to sit in the park with the blanket, but when I got there, I realized this made no sense. I climbed up a muddy slope into some trees in the park, nearly slipping many times as the ground was wet, and urinated in the bushes. I stood there for maybe 15 more minutes and then headed back home. It took me a while to get back home, and when I did, I went straight back to my bedroom. The experience of being outside was a bit nicer as the cold rain was a bit grounding, but at this point I felt so completely disconnected from my body that I felt like I was playing a third-person video game. When back in my room, I started to get more worried about how I was feeling and started to think about options. 20 hours now, at this point, I felt like I had 3 options. 1, jump out of my bedroom window and see what happened. It was high enough to kill me, but I was convinced I was already dead, so I wasn't sure what would happen. 2, go outside and call an ambulance. This was terrifying to me, though, as I was worried that if I was alive, they would strap me down in a mental asylum, and I would be trapped in this state of mind forever, as I would never have the opportunity to end my life, which was far preferable to feeling like this until I died of old age. 3, ask my friends or parents for help. I knew at this point that I was not in a mental place or strong enough to do anything on my own. I had some points where I felt a little more connected with reality and some less. Pervasive throughout this whole experience was the continuing pure terror. I decided that I did not want to jump out of my window as something very primal inside me. I guess my survival instinct was against this, even though it felt logical at the time to do it. I then decided to throw out all of my illegal substances and go outside and call an ambulance. However, when I got outside to call the ambulance, the fear of being imprisoned in an insane asylum forever was too overwhelming, and after thinking about it for around half an hour, I returned to my bedroom. 21 and a half hours now. At this point, after thinking some more, I decided that I had to speak to my housemate. I went out and found him and explained what was happening to him. At the time, I had a very strong feeling that he did not really exist and was just a figment of my imagination, but I figured there was no harm in speaking to him. He was helpful and comforted me, but did not really know how to handle the situation. We watched some stuff on TV, but I had trouble concentrating due to my mind being consumed by anxiety. I repeatedly asked my housemate to reassure me that he was real, and he did, and reassured me I would be fine. But I still assumed that this is just what the version of him that existed in my own personal hell would say to trick me. I was feeling slightly more relaxed, having had some human contact, but still a solid 9/10 on the scale of fear. 24 hours now. After sitting with housemate for a few hours, I realized that this was not going to cut it. He tried to convince me to go to hospital, but I was strongly against it due to the aforementioned fears. I instead opted to call my parents. However, I had to get him to explain what happened on the phone, as I was sobbing too much and felt completely paralyzed and unable to speak. My parents were very concerned and agreed to come and get me and take me home with them. 28 hours. At this point, I had survived the journey home with my parents, who were mostly just worried about me at this point. I was finally starting to calm down as I was able to notice more that my trip was coming to an end, and that as the anxiety started to fade, I started to feel more normal. I eventually finally managed to sleep for a bit. I will end the time-based prompts here and talk a bit more about the aftermath. For a few days after this experience, I struggled getting to sleep at all. Any slight thought about the nature of reality would trigger these feelings of me being dead and everything being not real and part of my personal hell again. I felt very dissociated from my body for this period. I had little appetite and did not have that many bodily sensations in general. These were, I guess, just the aftermath of the extremely long panic attacks and traumatic experience. Over the course of the next few days, the recurrent panic attacks became less frequent and severe. At first, I had to sleep in the same bed as someone else, but after around 3 days, I started being able to sleep alone. For the first week or so afterwards, I had to have someone in the same building as me at all times, or I would immediately have a panic attack. For the first 3 to 4 days, they had to be in the same room. Over the course of the next few weeks, I built up confidence being alone in a room and or building for longer periods of time until I could spend large portions of the day alone. I went to the doctors and was prescribed medication to help me sleep and help with anxiety. I also started therapy after a couple of weeks. The trauma of the experience caused me to develop some agoraphobia. As previously mentioned, this started off being a matter of being unable to be alone in any capacity. After a few weeks, it was more just a case of struggling to go outside. After a month, I was able to go outside on my own for some period of time, but still struggled with public and busy places. Over the course of the next few months, I gained confidence with being able to live more independently. Over the course of the next year, I gradually conquered the agoraphobia and panic attacks. After around 6 months, I was capable of living independently and was able to move out. I still had a few lapses where I had to travel back to my parents for a few weeks, but these became less frequent and severe until they just stopped occurring about a year after the initial experience. To this day, I still suffer with a very mild form of agoraphobia to do with being in places which are very far away from home or civilization, but I am confident I will conquer this too with time. This experience completely changed my life. It was traumatic and I would never wish it on anyone. I would urge everyone to respect the power of these drugs and make sure they take them only in a safe and good space, and make sure they have a plan for if the trip heads south. In hindsight, I have gained some positive things from it. My capacity for handling traumatic experiences is much, much higher now, and it forced me to come clean to my parents about my lifelong mental health issues and seek traditional treatment for these. I still have occasionally moments of panic, and writing this was very difficult as it caused me to relive some of these memories. The feeling of being alive and reality existing gradually came back, but took a long time to be something that didn't bother me. I still have no proof that I'm alive or that anything exists, but I have the philosophy that it does not matter, as I am capable of enjoying whatever my existence may be. If I am stuck in a personal hell, it's not so bad. I have quite a lot of fun, and my life is pretty enjoyable these days. For anyone who has experienced anything like this, it does get better. And please be open with those who care about you and let them help you heal. Life can be great even if this takes a year or so from you. Note, I did not have a tolerance to LSD at the time. It was a typical Saturday afternoon. A week prior, I'd made plans with 3 of my friends to trip on some very potent liquid LSD we had picked up recently. I was given a serious warning from my dealer not to consume more than 3 drops. He sincerely claimed that the vial needed to have a warning label on it. His source had driven several hours to another city just to obtain the acid because it was such a wicked batch. It was supposedly barely diluted. Being my usual skeptical self, I decided I was going to ignore his advice and go balls deep to see what beautiful places my mind could take me to. My friends were very inexperienced with LSD for the most part. One friend, who will be called Jam, had tripped a total of 7 or so times. Another, D, a single time, actually 2 days before this trip. And the other, K.A., was dropping for his first time for his birthday. The day seemed all too perfect for anything to mess up, despite the fact that during this time in my life I had had a myriad of personal issues and insecurities that could possibly lead to bad experiences, but I didn't completely take that into account. I'm honestly starting to get slightly uneasy, even thinking about the experience I'm about to describe. Around 3:30 p.m., my friend KY, he was sober, picked me up from my house. He was with D and KA, who were minutes away from consuming their acid. We drove to my other friend's house, where my personal stash of acid was sitting in the freezer. The LSD was dropped onto sugar cubes. Our plan was to drive to our friend Jack's house and enjoy the ride in a safe setting, while the people that opted not to trip smoked marijuana. I walked into his house and saw a couple of my friends there. We briefly conversed and smoked a bowl of top-quality CBD-rich sativa marijuana, an antipsychotic chemical in marijuana that reduces anxiety, for a few minutes as a way to ease me into my trip. Haha, yeah, right, I believe this is what made the come-up so overwhelmingly fast. I pulled a whopping 5 sugar cubes out of the freezer and shoved them in my mouth, then licked a bunch of sugar crumbles off the foil, which came from the edges of the 11 sugar cubes I had in my stash. My friends were a bit shocked I was willing to go that far, but they sort of already were used to my tendency to consume large quantities of psychedelic drugs. I talked with them for another 10 minutes or so. Then I went back to the car. On my way to the car, I noticed I was starting to feel increasingly disoriented. It wasn't that euphoric, confusing sort of disorientation. It was more of a, I'm losing effing my mind sort of thing. I felt slightly anxious, but I assumed the negative feelings would pass as soon as the acid took full effect. A couple of minutes after I got in the car, D ate 2 sugar cubes and KA ate 1. I suspect this was easily around 1,000 micrograms. I have consumed 100 plus less UG blotter that did not compare at all to this liquid. On a separate occasion, taking 2 of these was enough for a level 4 experience. Hallucinations. ESP. Oobies. The experience was about to get very, very ugly. To give a little perspective on the unfathomable effects of 1,000 mic doses, here's a quote from the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Kary Mullis that ingested 1,000 micrograms for his first dose. When you take 1,000 micrograms of LSD, you don't know you've taken anything It just feels like that's the way it is. You might suddenly find yourself sitting on a building in Egypt 3,000 years ago watching boats on the Nile. Yes, it is that effing crazy. 10 minutes into the car ride and 20 minutes after eating the sugar cubes, I was rapidly losing all touch with reality. I started wondering what the F was going on around me and why I was feeling so uncomfortable. I started telling my friends I was really scared, and the intense anxiety was gripping every single fiber of my body. I thought I was going to die, and that this trip was going to last until the end of eternity. By the minute, I was starting to panic more. This was only the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare that would show me the evil side of LSD and completely change my opinion about the drug in general. 25 minutes after taking the sugar cubes, we arrived at Jack's house. By that time, I was stumbling all over the place, and I was already having severe visual distortion. All movements were followed by strobing trails composed of detailed patterns, kaleidoscopes, and rainbows. These visuals, that I would have usually considered beautiful, were now viewed as a reminder that I was in the middle of a trip that I so desperately wanted to end. When I got inside his house, I saw a few more of my friends sitting on the couch. My body temperature had elevated to the point I thought I was burning alive. I was completely out of my body and almost felt like I was on a high dose of ketamine. I felt embarrassed because I obviously looked like I couldn't handle my shit. Maybe this was just an extreme amplification of my general self-esteem issues. Their faces were assuming demonic forms. I fled to Jack's room. I was already starting to experience ego loss. I was going in and out of consciousness. This is the point where I lost track of time, so there is no point of trying to estimate anything. Jack followed me to his room and did his best to comfort me and talk me out of my bad trip. It was a completely ineffective attempt. A couple minutes later, I started crying hysterically. Everything was getting darker. I fell into the most depressive state of my life, combined with the most acute sense of panic I've ever experienced. The floor was covered in spiraling kaleidoscopes that were rapidly shifting colors. I heard thousands of voices call me names like pussy and bitch. The room reeked of sewage and feces. This was the most negative emotion a human being could ever fathom. I so desperately wanted to kill myself, but I was immobilized and unable to move. I realized that the voices were of all of the people I resented in my life the most. Cartoon blood was all over the ceiling and the walls. My vision seemed to stretch off into infinity. I was hallucinating so much I couldn't believe it. I could see many different events of my life playing out as if it was waking reality. Try and imagine being inside of a Saw movie firsthand, but 1,000 times more horrifying and traumatic. There was a moment in which my mind would shoot out of my body 2 feet in front of me, and then return into my body, and this looped over and over again for what felt like forever at an impossible speed. Time was non-existent, and a second felt like forever. Not hours, not days, but an infinite amount of time. I kept hearing this bizarre futuristic noise that sounded like a computer glitching. The whole room was flashing as if something was flicking the on switch for a lamp up and down repeatedly. My jaw was rapidly vibrating like I had taken 300 mg of MDMA. I always get major jaw clenching from acid. I had full-blown synesthesia. Everything was one. Everything was infinitely interconnected. I would look at the walls and become the walls. I would look at the floor and then become the floor, looking back at my body in a dissociative fashion. I was unable to differentiate any part of the outside world from my own physical body. The concept of I was now a mere construct of my mind, and I was nothing more than a complex bundle of atoms and molecules. The floor started to wither away and die. It was as if it had human emotions and was feeling every bit of suffering I was going through at the time. Everything started to turn blood red. I was going straight to the depths of hell. Matrix numbers were literally exploding out of the ground and shooting up and down the walls. I felt like I was on DMT, only it was 1,000 times more intense. Somehow, just a little while after this part of the trip, I regained some degree of consciousness. I stumbled to the backyard where a group of 8 or so people were sitting, and I was watching the sky and everything in my external environment turning black and red. I could barely see anything. My vision was almost completely shot. I forget that I even had a body at this point, and I had absolutely no control over my muscular movements. I was in this survival mode where my mind was on autopilot and I had no idea that I was on drugs. I lost balance and fell backward onto the ground. I continued to see more incredible vortexes of Matrix-style numbers and letters spurt out from every direction. During my friends' attempts to help restore me to sanity, they asked if I knew what time it was. I responded with 8 a.m. when it was late in the afternoon. That was quite enough of a response to prove I was completely and utterly going nuts, and there was no real way to help me. Once night fell, I was full-on peeking in Jack's room. I began to literally have no idea who I was, where I was, or what drug I was on, or what drugs were in the first place. I knew that I was going to die, and nothing could be done to stop it. At some point at the beginning of the peak, I realized that I could not recognize the room I was in. Suddenly, I started seeing several cop cars pull into the room and put their sirens on. Yellow caution tape magically appeared around them as well. This was one of my worst nightmares coming to life before my very eyes. There was a line of already arrested criminals in handcuffs next to the cop cars, and they were all complaining that I had snitched on them for some unspecified reason. I knew I was in for absolute hell. Before I could see what was going to happen next, everything started fading to white. I could see nothing but burning white light, like I was looking directly at the sun from 100 feet away. What I saw was the ultimate truth, the answer to every question. The reason reality is the way that it is. I existed within the past, present, and future simultaneously. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I dissolved into infinity. I was existing in an infinite number of dimensions, living an infinite number of lives simultaneously for an infinite amount of time. Though my memory of this is hazy, I believe I relived every event of my entire life during the peak. I could fit our entire universe into a period at the end of a sentence. Time was a point of nothingness. I was everything, yet I was nothing. I was in pure ecstasy. I felt the unconditional love of the universe penetrating every pore of my body. If only this could have lasted forever. I suppose this was a taste of the beautiful part of ego death, but my stay in this ineffable place was cut short when I was suddenly catapulted into hyperspace, where I experienced every ounce of pain any human being could ever possibly experience at one time. The love rapidly shifted to evil in its purest definition. I saw many miserable people I had seen throughout my life, including the homeless and starving. My brain's sensory filter was gone. Every last bit of information that could physically be processed at once was flowing through my head at light speed. I was dropped out of hyperspace directly into a hallucinatory prison facility. I saw hundreds of pit bulls, murderers, and naked black men running around. It was a state of sheer pandemonium. I have never been so unbelievably horrified in my entire life. I was now sure that this is where I would die. I was taken to the showers where I was bitten repeatedly by pit bulls and raped by the prisoners. I was sobbing hysterically, screaming for it to stop. It was physical and emotional torture beyond your wildest dreams. I felt every single sensation, including their penises in my anus and the razor-sharp teeth of the vicious dogs. Who knows how long this actually went on for, but eventually this torture ended and I was back in Jack's room. I saw all of my friends' faces covered in knife wounds and deep bleeding cuts. Puddles of blood were all over the room. My joints were still in severe pain from the physical torture I had just experienced. I looked at the clock and it read 9 p.m. or something along those lines. Minutes after I came back to Earth, I realized that the purpose for human existence was to love. Love is our higher purpose. I now understood that the ego I had developed my entire life was an illusion all along. Our egos push us away from our ability to feel compassion towards others. As your ego fades away, you slowly dissolve into pure, unadulterated love. The illusion of separation created by our egos has been the root cause of suffering all across our planet. And sadly, this is the reason the majority of the world kills each other for absurd purposes like resources. There is nothing to fear because when you die, there is no you to fear anything. The only thing that separates us from other forms of life is our ability to think. Our ego is composed of our thoughts. When we stop relying on our ego, we cannot experience negative emotions. When we stop thinking, our ego ceases to exist, and then we can live a life of pure love, peace, and prosperity. The more we rely on our ego, the more we push ourselves away from the moment, which is all. Nothing outside the moment we are in right now will ever exist. Yesterday never is, and tomorrow will never be. Time is infinite. The past, present, and future are all occurring simultaneously. We are merely observers. Free will is an illusion. This was by far the most profound experience of my entire life. I quickly forgot all of these things within 15 minutes of the peak ending. I didn't fully understand the lessons I learned for until months had passed after the trip. The next day was easily the worst day of my life, excluding the trip. I felt so self-conscious about myself that suicide was all I could think about. I was thoroughly convinced that I had ruined my life permanently. During ego death, I became aware of the severity of my many mental disorders. I realized that throughout my entire life, I had been looked down upon as the special kid. I had not been aware of this until that moment. I felt like the most inferior form of life on the face of the earth. After I got home, I burst into tears. I even thought my family felt sorry for me and had pitied me my whole life because they thought I was a moron. I had a psychotic break for weeks afterwards. This was easily the most traumatic thing I've ever gone through in my entire life and has left a lasting mark on me that I carry to this day. It's been over 6 months now, and I think about this trip every day of my life. It's nothing any human being ever deserves to go through, and I would never wish it on my worst enemy. Over time, this trip has had a profound impact on all areas of my life in both positive and negative ways. Positive. I have very close friends now, and rather than the special kid, many people now view me as a very insightful and intelligent person. Before this experience, I had very, very few friends. I wasn't close friends with the ones mentioned in this report, but we chilled every once in a while. I now know what true friendship is. I go to parties, I meet new people all the time. I suspect I used to have a mild form of autism, and this trip literally eradicated it. My entire family has mentioned multiple times that I'm a transformed person. I have fully developed social skills. I act normally now. I view everyone I meet as a part of my own consciousness. I've earned excellent grades at my community college and have grown tremendously. Multiple people have commented that I'm an entirely different person. I've taken up Buddhism and adopted a very spiritual lifestyle. Negative. Several months ago, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I suspect I was already predisposed to this condition, and the trip brought it out. I still have mental flashbacks nearly every day and have been scarred by experience. I frequently have nightmares about this trip. My thoughts can be very scattered and clouded at times. My thinking is very impaired on some days, but it's very sporadic. I've learned how effed up our world is, and sometimes I feel that ignorance is bliss. Our society disgusts me. I think that the human race is a joke. I'm going to say one thing: do not take a high dose of acid unless you have a proper set and setting, or it can turn into the worst nightmare of your entire life. 300 micrograms is more than enough to have a spiritual experience. The 1,000 and plus micrograms did not provide a near-death experience. It provided a beyond-death experience. LSD is a seriously powerful drug, and it has the ability to F a person like nothing they could ever conceive of. In fact, after this experience, I firmly believe it is the most powerful drug known to the human race. Like and subscribe.